Throughout this course, we have talked informally about the different branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches. In this segment, we are going to examine in more depth how they interact, a doctrine sometimes called the separation of powers, but also called the system of checks and balances. With the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the former American colonies that made up the United States each adopted a constitution. They did, after all, conceive of themselves as 13 separate sovereign entities. And the Articles of Confederation, which set up the First Continental Congress, was really more like a multilateral treaty among sovereign parties, much like the European Union. And it was only with the Constitution of 1789, the Constitution we still live with only 27 amendments in over 200 years, that set up the federal government and bound us together as a single sovereign nation. So all the institutions, the federal legislature, the presidency, the federal courts, were really newly created, one might say invented institutions. They were abstractions that the founding generation and then subsequent generations came to inhabit and to which our history gave life. This sense of novelty, of invention, is proclaimed on the motto on the back of the dollar bill. Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of generations, a quotation from Virgil. Of course, there were models. The framers did not make up the national government out of whole cloth. The 1780 Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in large part the work of John Adams, a founding father, signatory of the Declaration of Independence and second president, provides in Article 30 of the Declaration of the Rights of the Inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in the government of this Commonwealth, the legislative department shall never exercise the executive and judicial powers, or either of them. The executive shall never exercise the legislative or judicial powers, or either of them. The judicial shall never exercise the legislative and executive powers, or either of them, to the end that it may be a government of laws and not of men. The federal Constitution, adopted by the states in 1789, is much more austere than Adams's flowery language. It provides simply, at the beginning of Article 1, the legislative power shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. Article 2 begins, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. And Article 3, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts that the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The Supreme Court has, over the course of our history, drawn from this spare language the implication that the framers had sought to adopt much the same conception of the separation of powers as John Adams described in the Massachusetts Constitution. The idea of the separation of powers and its connection to the liberty of the citizens is deeply embedded in constitutional theory. John Locke, a preeminent 17th century British philosopher and one of the principal influences on the framers of the Constitution, insisted particularly on the separation of the executive power, in his day the power of the monarch, and the legislative power which resided in Parliament. It was for the great 18th century French political theorist Montesquieu to formulate and elaborate the notion of separation of powers in the most complete form. Montesquieu's work on the spirit of the laws was well known to the framers of the Constitution and was a powerful influence upon them. Locke and Montesquieu did not limit the application of this idea to constitutional democracies, such as our own. Both applied it as well to monarchic and aristocratic regimes, such as those in which they lived. Even in such regimes, the premise was that the monarch, the king, or the body of the aristocrats would not have the sole power in their hands, but rather, in such regimes, the power would be dispersed between an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. Implicit in their thought, therefore, was the stated or unstated premise that these regimes would in some sense be constitutional, not necessarily within a written constitutional, not a constitution with a large C, but rather that the Constitution, that is the makeup of the government, should establish and maintain the separation of these three functions. The basic idea is nicely captured by the familiar prescription for the fair division of a pie. One person cuts and the other person chooses. In the developed governmental version of this simple idea of fairness, the legislative branch makes up the general rules, the rules of the game, as it were. The executive then plays the game according to those rules. The judiciary is the referee and makes sure first that the game that the legislature has set out somehow comports with the general idea of the kind of game that it is, football and not wrestling. And then the judiciary goes on to decide whether the executive is playing according to the rules of that game, following the rules. The first function might be thought to be the judiciary enforcing the Constitution, the idea of the kind of game we are playing. And the second is keeping the executive within the rules it is supposed to be implementing. If the legislature can make up any rules for any game at all, including the rules which assign the implementing function to itself or to committees of itself, as happened during the French Revolution, then we have the danger, indeed the reality, of legislative tyranny, and the liberty of the individual is insecure. That is why from the beginning of our republic, the judicial branch was assumed to have the authority to declare particular acts of legislation unconstitutional. The legislature was playing the wrong kind of game. It is not playing a game of constitutional democracy. But the judiciary also keeps the executive in check. It keeps the executive within the rules of the game that the legislature has properly set up. This metaphor breaks down a little when you realize it is the function of the judiciary also to adjudicate disputes not only between the parts of the government and between the citizens and the executive, but also between the citizens among each other. But in doing so, the judiciary is making sure that the citizens also are playing or have played according to the rules of the game that the legislature has set out. Alexander Hamilton, a Revolutionary War hero and one of the architects of the federal Constitution, in the Federalist Papers, written to convince the citizens of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution, referred to the judiciary as the least dangerous branch. One of the reasons for that judgment was that the executive is the one that is on the field and running the army, collecting the taxes, building the bridges, and so on. And Hamilton's thought was that the judges do not declare war, do not run the military, don't collect the taxes or build the bridges, don't have the money or the arms or the helpers who can do such things. Their job, as John Marshall said early in our republic, is to say what the law is. In other words, to indicate when the executive is playing according to the rules that the legislative branch has set out, and, in constitutional cases, whether the legislative branch is in fact making up the rules for the right kind of game. The kind of game, generally speaking, being a democratic, constitutional republic. In modern constitutional democracy, the tasks of government are many, various, and pervasive. The rulemaking body, the legislature, operates as a large, deliberative body negotiating and coming to general conclusions in the form of laws. As such, it could not possibly manage and implement the policies it mandates for a complex society. That is why there must be an executive. The executive is the police force, the military, the writer of the checks, the printer of the money, the builder of the roads, the manager of the post office. All of these many functions are carried out within the general rules set out by the legislature. How the executive does this and the rise of the administrative state is explored in greater depth in another segment.